When this chapter closes, remember, courage isn't about being unafraid, it's about choosing who you'll stand with when it counts. If this journey sparks something in you, carry it forward and be the bridge someone else needs. Dan Rios pressed his forehead to the transport's cold viewport as the station grew from a glitter to a wheel of glass and machinery. Helix 7 spun in silence, a jeweled ring against an ocean of stars. 3 months of language drills, etiquette guidelines, and interspecies law hadn't prepared him for the real thing. Oxygen that smelled faintly metallic, engines humming like a hive, and the knowledge that every other student on board had evolved very far from him. Docking clamps whispered shut. Doors opened with a sterile sigh. Dan shouldered his single sat bag and stepped into the arrival bay, right into a crowd that parted like he carried a contagion. Tall figures, low figures, chitin and fur and ripple-skinned beings in guided carts. A translucent entity in a mobile tank bobbed away when he drifted near. No one spoke to him. No one needed to. Their flinches said enough. The official waiting at the gate had slate-gray skin and a yellow assessing stare. "You are the human," he said, flatly declarative. Not welcoming Dan Rios. "From Earth," Dan answered, trying not to sound like an apology. "I am Warden Talon, follow." The warden pivoted and strode off, tail of a coat whispering. They passed students clustering in knots to whisper. Dan caught words he'd learned but wished he hadn't. Deathworld, Apex, Endurance Predator. A trio of furred sophomores crossed the corridor to avoid his shoulder. His face burned. He'd been new kid before. This was different. Here he wasn't the new student. He was the new species. Quarters, Section 7, Talon said without looking back. Standard curriculum. No incidents. "I don't cause problems," Dan said, voice smaller than he'd intended. Talon stopped. Those yellow eyes narrowed. "Your world is classed hostile. Persistence-hunting primates, toxin-dense biosphere. Here, you're a hazard symbol with shoes. If the others fear you, they do so with cause. Return that fear with restraint." He started walking again. Dan swallowed the comeback that would help nothing. "Yes, sir." His room was compact, tidy, and smelled faintly like antiseptic citrus. One narrow bed, one desk, one window framing a clipped triangle of starlight. He dropped his bag, sat, and pulled out a slim slate. His family had sent a still image before jump. Mom and Dad in their backyard under a crooked string of lights. His little sister Ani holding up a sign drawn in fat marker. "Come home fast." Dan pressed a thumb to Ani's dimpled grin until his throat tightened. Then he slid the slate under the pillow and told himself he'd be fine. He got lost twice the next morning and stumbled into xenobiology late enough that every gaze found him. The professor, Halvey, a long-limbed scholar whose skin slow-shifted through cautious colors, paused mid-sentence. Dan crossed the room toward an empty seat. The being beside it quietly gathered her bag and moved away. Halvey resumed, voice like brushed paper. "Ecologies teach behaviors. Behaviors teach ethics. Ethics dictate contact." Forearms drew figures in air, projected images of forests and ice-plate seas. Dan tried to focus, but the micro-glances kept puncturing the lecture. During group work, partners evaporated. He built his own model in silence. Lunch was worse. The food printer asked for his biochemistry, and delivered something that resembled a sandwich if you squinted. Every table he approached calcified into full. Finally, he sat alone, chewing cardboard courage. Across the room, an orange-furred student with wide green eyes watched him while her friends whispered. Dan pretended not to hear the word human every third breath. With a free hour after, he fled to the observation deck. Level 12 opened beneath a clear dome, and the station's rotation carried constellations like slow music. For one pure minute, he just breathed. Space did that. Reminded you that you were small, yes, but also held. "Beautiful," someone said behind him. He turned. The orange-furred student stood there, white stripes like comet tracks across her arms. Up close, her eyes were inquisitive rather than afraid. "I am Nera," she said. "I spoke of you at lunch." "That was unkind. I'm sorry." "It's fine," Dan said, aiming for casual and landing somewhere near exhausted. "Everyone's been doing it." "We know stories," she said, ears angling back. "Of your storms, your endurance, how your kind can run prey to collapse. I can run 1 mile before I wheeze. 2, if there's a dog chasing me," Dan said. "At home we call them pets. You keep predators?" Bewilderment pulled her ears flat. "Small ones," he said. "They purr. It helps, he half smiled. Humans put sharp things on the sofa and then get attached. Nara considered that as if weighing strata. Strange, she said. But not bad strange. A beat. I have class. Yeah. Dan from Earth, she said, testing the shape of his name. Perhaps we will speak again. She left a little of her warmth behind when she walked away. Evening brought xenobiology again. Halvey, this time lecturing about Helix 7's research levels. Containment facilities exist to observe hazardous life under strict redundancies, he said, listing species like sacred curses, night serpents, shadowlopes, and, Dan's stomach nodded, the nightclaw of Thorn Vale. An 8-limbed, silver-marked apex with high social intelligence and no known domestication. A hollow projection unfurled. Long body, extra limbs for balance and hold, eyes lit with an awareness that could empty you. Dan thought of cages and tried to file the thought away, but it stuck like a burr. When class ended, he called home. How's the stars, kiddo? Dad asked. Still there, Dan said, and lied around the edges. After, the room felt smaller than before, the bed harder, the station hum louder. He stared at the ceiling and counted breaths until sleep finally climbed over him and pulled the blanket up. 2 weeks later, routine had sanded the edges off his loneliness without removing it. Classes, solo lunches, study, the occasional nod from Nara in passing, almost a conversation. Not quite. Then the station shivered. Lights flickered. The air, not the air, the sound inside it, changed pitch. Attention, the ceiling speaker said in a calm voice that practiced for fires. Technical irregularities reported in research sector. Proceed to dormitories and remain. This is not a drill. The corridors erupted. Bodies pressed. Voices sharpened. Emergency lights bled the world red. Containment breach. A new voice cut in, stripped of calm. Sector 9. Students near a safe room. Do not attempt, the crowd convulsed. Dan saw Nara slammed against a wall by the surge. He shoved his way through, hauled her free by the elbow. This way, he yelled above the rising chorus of fear. They ran. Behind the sirens, something else roared, raw, primal, too big to fit in a throat. Metal screamed. Somewhere, a door died badly. Nara's breath hitched. What was... Something that shouldn't be loose, Dan said. They turned a corner and nearly collided with Halvey. The professor's skin had gone shock pale. Nightclaw, he gasped. The adult. 2 guards down. Shelter, now. A second roar threaded through the vents, higher, frightened. The Cubs, Dan said. Forget the Cubs. Halvey snapped. Survive. He bolted. Nara grabbed Dan's sleeve. Safe room. You go, he said. I need to check something. Dan, that's an 8-limbed... Those cries were babies. He had already started running. Red light licked the walls. Abandoned carts spun in their own shadows. Overhead, something heavy moved in the ventilation tangle. Swift, precise. Dan followed the thin sound of frightened churring to a lab whose door hung crooked. Inside, chaos. Shattered glass. Papers like snowfall. And 2 small shapes jammed behind an overturned cabinet. 30 pounds apiece, dark fur streaked with silver. 4 bright eyes. Too many teeth. They hissed. He saw past teeth to trembling. It's okay, he said, palms open, lowering himself until metal chilled his knees. I'm not here to hurt you. He stayed still. He told them soft, ridiculous things. About Ani's lopsided drawings. About a hound named Copper that slept like a stone. About pancakes on Sundays. Hissing softened, ears rose. The uninjured one crept closer, nose like a cold coin against his knuckles. There you go, Dan whispered. The limping cub whimpered. Let me see that. He moved slowly, narrating every inch as if words were a leash. The cut was shallow, angry. He found a med kit and cleaned it while the sibling watched, teeth bared, ready to intervene. I know, he murmured. I'm sorry. This will sting less than infection. By the time he finished, the red light felt duller. The cubs, he wouldn't call them monsters, were pressed against his legs, warm and smelling like rain on hot rock. Somewhere deeper in the station, the mother roared again. She sounded like an earthquake learning grief. Dan put an arm around each small ribcage. We need to get you somewhere safer, he said. And then we figure out how to get you back to her. The station hunts the mother hunts the station. Dan has just chosen a side. He named them before he had a plan, which is one way humans tell themselves they'll keep promises. The injured one with the brighter silver tracery became Kira. The darker, more cautious sibling answered to Lex by the third repetition and a ration crumb bribe. They ate like hollow drums. He rationed like someone who'd learned the hard way that emergencies last longer than you hope. Security boots thundered past in the corridor. The cubs pressed closer, muscles quivering. "It's all right," Dan whispered, though it wasn't. "I won't let them take you." The words surprised him, but they didn't feel like lies. He found a storage room that's still locked and built a nest out of lab coats and emergency blankets. The cubs collapsed into it as though someone had turned off their batteries. Dan leaned against the wall, adrenaline ebbing into the kind of shivers you don't admit to. If anyone found them, he'd be expelled at best. At worst, he'd be a headline and a cautionary tale. Hours smudged by. The emergency lighting kept everything medieval. Twice Kira dreamed, paws twitching, a soft keening in her throat that cut something inside Dan. He checked the bandage again and again because doing helped. When the cubs woke, they demanded food with chirps that tickled instinct. Dan found carnivore bars in a cabinet with pictograms that could have been warnings or marketing. Either way, the cubs approved. They ate with gratitude and tiny, ferocious sounds. After, Lex butted his head under Dan's hand and rumbled. Kira wedged in from the other side, insisting on equal distribution of scratches. "You're just kids," he told them, as if they didn't know. The station beyond the door creaked and complained. Somewhere metal died again. Somewhere a voice shouted orders through teeth. Between, the mother's calls braided with the ventilation current, searching, furious in pain. "She's looking for you," Dan said. The cub's ears pivoted toward the sound like little satellites. He felt stupid for talking to them like they spoke his language. He kept doing it. "We can't stay here forever. They'll sweep this level top to bottom. We need to move. We need to think like she does." The ventilation system ran everywhere. He'd seen maintenance schematics during orientation. The ducts laced the station like nerves. If the mother could travel unseen, so could 3 smaller bodies and a too stubborn human. He pried off an access panel. Cold air shouldered out and carried a scent that lit the cubs from the inside. Lex made a series of rapid clicks Dan hadn't heard before. Kira answered with a questioning trill that tugged somehow behind his sternum. "Is that her?" he asked. "Is that—" Lex didn't wait. He sprang into the shaft with the effortless grace of a species grown in trees and shadow. Kira followed, limping less now that purpose had reduced pain to a smaller planet. Dan hesitated only long enough to lock the storage room behind them, habit more than strategy, and hauled himself into the duct. The world became metal and breath. He crawled, palms squealing, knees already burning. The cubs moved ahead with a precision that made the duct seem designed for them. They paused at junctions, sniffing, ears swiveling, then chose with confidence that left Dan both impressed and terrified. Twice they backtracked, chittered, and nudged him away from a side shaft moments before security voices echoed there. Time melted into a sequence of decisions. Up, left, down a steep run that turned his shoulders to fire. He learned to read them. The way Lex's tail stiffened at danger. The way Kira's whiskers thrummed when a scent grew fresher. He matched his breathing to their pauses. They accepted his presence as a fact, like air or gravity. He tried to deserve it. They reached a junction where 3 ducts met. The cubs froze, bodies trembling with a live wire current. Dan heard it too then, breathing that didn't belong to ducks or humans. Heavy, controlled, edged with pain. "Easy," he whispered. To them or himself, he didn't know. They slipped forward into a broader maintenance hub where cables draped like vines. She lay in the middle, larger than the hollows, reality stealing the last illusions. The Nightclaw mother's fur was night poured over muscle, silver marks catching emergency glare. Wounds scored her shoulders and flanks where steel had argued with will and lost. She lifted her head when the cubs spilled from the duct with a chorus of broken, relieved sounds, and the sound she made in return wasn't a roar. It was a note built for the inside of chests. She checked them nose to nose, paw to paw, tongue brisk over Kira's bandage. Then she looked up and saw the human. Dan didn't have to be told not to move. Predator recognition is older than language. She rose, placing herself between him and the cubs, a geometry of threat and purpose. Her eyes were too intelligent. They measured. "I didn't hurt them," Dan said, voice steady, because that's what you do with wild things. You give them the gift of your calm. I cleaned the little one's cut. I fed them. I brought them here. They trusted me. She stepped forward, each paw placed like a promise. Dan could smell her up close. Rain on stone, grounded ozone, the iron of old blood. She lowered her head and breathed him in. Hair, face, hands, the places where Cub's scent clung. Behind his calves, Lex pressed against him hard enough to bruise, and Kira added her small, insistent weight. Their mother's ears twitched. The growl in her chest faltered. Dan didn't reach. He offered stillness. He offered the way you stand when a stranger must decide if you belong near their children. Something shifted in her expression. He thought ridiculous, he saw comprehension. She stepped back one pace. The sound in her throat changed, losing teeth and gaining question. "They're good kids," he said softly. "You did right by them." She sank to a guarded crouch. The cubs poured back into her gravity, scrambling over forelimbs and tucking under her chest. She watched Dan through that alive, unsettling gaze, unblinking. "We can't stay here," Dan told the room, the universe himself. "If security finds us like this, they won't listen. They'll shoot. I need to get you somewhere softer than a cage and quieter than a chase." He pulled his student tablet, battery miraculously alive, opened a low-permission station map, and hunted for any room forgotten by authority. An old observation lab on level 8 had been emptied for renovation and left to gather dust. One corridor over, two up, manageable. Maybe. He pointed toward the upward shaft. "That way," he told the mother, aware of how insane the words were. The cubs made eager pulsing sounds and launched toward the duct. The mother watched Dan for one breath longer, then followed the only things in the universe that mattered to her. They climbed. Together, 3 shadows and a human, who'd misread his job description, toward a room with windows on stars and dust on everything else. The lab was bare except for shrouded shapes. Dan skidded out of the duct, pulled a panel in with him, and started draping equipment with sheets to break lines and blur edges. The mother watched, head tilted. Then, utterly, beautifully unexpected, she took a sheet in her teeth and dragged it, copying the motion. The cubs copied her, of course. That was the first time Dan almost laughed since the alarms. They curled behind covered racks where sight lines died. Outside, a security sweep passed. The door handle creaked. "Weapons rustled like unhappy grass. Clear?" a voice said after an eternity. "Next room." When the door shut, Dan realized he was sweating enough to tack his shirt to his back. He couldn't keep them hidden for long. He needed a bridge. He messaged the only person who might cross it with him. "Nara. Need a favor. Observation Lab 8C, come alone. Please trust me." Minutes dragged. Then on my way. This had better be. The door hissed and Nara slipped inside with her fur puffed out by pure adrenaline. "Dan? Why here? What?" Kira's small head poked from behind a draped console. Nara froze. Lex padded into view. The mother unfolded from the shadows like night deciding to stand up. Nara made a sound that wasn't a word. Her hand found the panel, searching for open. Dan got there first. "Please," he said. "Just look. She killed guards," Nara said, voice threadbare. "There's a chute on site." "She's a mother," Dan said. "Her children were stolen. What would you do?" Nara didn't answer. She watched as Kira butted Dan's thigh with the familiarity of a creature who had decided. She watched as the mother allowed Dan to set a palm, slowly, reverently, against her fur and didn't remove his hand with teeth. "This cannot be real," Nara whispered. "Nightclaws don't tame." "Good," Dan said. "We aren't taming anyone. We're listening. Dan has an ally, maybe, but he's about to invite the people with guns." Nara paced the length of the lab, eyes flicking between Dan's hand on living myth and the door where consequences lived. "You are asking me," she said finally, "to bring the warden to a negotiation with a predator that killed 2 guards. You, a first year, will mediate." "I'm asking you to prevent more killing," Dan said. "If they push through that door with weapons, she defends her family. Everyone loses. Warden Talon will never. He will if the alternatives are lawsuits, scandal, and an airlock closed around Helix 7's reputation." Dan kept his voice even. "And he'll listen to you more than to me." Nara's ears tilted. The mother watched her with a hunter's stillness, head low, eyes bright with meanings no human grammar could hold. The cubs, oblivious to politics, wrestled on Dan's boots. Nara flinched when Kira squeaked and then looked embarrassed about flinching. "All right," she said at last. "I will try." Dan, if this ends badly, they will expel you. Or worse, I know, he said. Please hurry. He waited with the Nightclaw family in a quiet shaped like prayer. The mother shifted, positioning herself where she could launch at the door if it opened wrong. Dan positioned himself where he could be a shield if it opened wrong. He didn't dwell on how small a shield he was. The door hissed. Warden Talon entered with Security Chief Vor and 6 guards who remembered how to aim. Nara stood just behind Talon's shoulder, jaw set. Everyone stopped. Dan exhaled like stepping onto ice. We need to talk, weapons tracked to fur. The mother rose, placing her weight between metal and cub. Every muscle in the room turned into wire. Nobody fires, Talon said, shock flattening his voice. Stand down. For now. How many of my people have to die before for now ends? Vor asked without taking his eyes off the Nightclaw. 0 more, Dan said before Talon could answer. That's the point of this meeting. Talon tore his attention away from the impossible tableau long enough to squint at Dan. Explain. Dan didn't step away from the mother. He figured the geometry mattered. You acquired a family from Thornvale through channels that are generously questionable. The adult fought to protect her young. She will keep fighting, or we can choose not to be her enemies. Choose? Vor's voice sliced. She defended her children from kidnappers. Dan gestured to the cubs headbutting his shins. If someone took yours, what would you do? Silence thinned, then held. Proposal, Dan said. A truce. No weapons in this room, food, medical for the adult. Observation through the glass. I stay with them to keep everyone calm. In return, you prepare a transport. Return them to Thornvale and after, reform. Stop buying sentience from smugglers. Rewrite your policy. Learn without cages. You are a first year, Talon said. It could have been condemnation. Somehow it sounded like evaluation. I'm also the one the mother trusts, Dan said. And right now I'm the difference between this ending in blood or in policy. The mother made a low, rich sound. Dan didn't know the Nightclaw word for agreement if they had such words. He knew she was letting him speak for 5 heartbeats longer. Halvey arrived breathless, skin pulsing with colors Dan hadn't seen before. He took in the scene, and for once the professor had no theory. By every metric, he murmured, this is impossible. Then let's pick a new metric, Dan said. Talon closed his eyes briefly as if listening to an internal counsel. When he opened them, the decision had settled. Stand down, he said to Vor. We attempt a truce. Vor's jaw flexed. Then discipline layered over fury. He signaled the squad to lower muzzles. No one relaxed. You don't relax when a storm chooses not to break over you. The next 3 days redrew lines. The lab became a habitat in all but paperwork. No bars, no shocks. Soft flooring rolled over metal. A vent hood purred fresher air. Food arrived on carts delivered by guards who kept their hands open and their eyes wide. The mother, Nara, started calling her shade and the name stuck. Watched everything with a queen's suspicion and a scientist's attention. She tolerated Halvey's presence for hours through glass. Then through a half-open door, then, miracle by millimeter, inside, seated and empty-handed. Shade initiated contact first because it had to be her idea. She dropped the cloth ball Dan had tied from scrap at Halvey's feet. The professor blinked like someone had told him gravity was optional. He nudged the ball back gently. Shade caught it, repeated. Rumbled. She wants to play. Halvey whispered, awe peeling years off his voice. She wants to show you she's more than your models. Dan said quietly. That's the lesson. Write it down. Word leaked beyond Helix 7's walls like light. Messages streamed in, anger, wonder, demands. A transmission from Thornvale's council used a word that made the station flinch, citizens, to describe Shade and her cubs. It also used kidnapped. Administrators convened and wore their serious voices. Vor remained a winter storm orbiting a warm room. He never stepped inside, but he stayed. Watching. Counting the seconds in which no one died. On the 4th day of truce, Nara brought Dan a tray of academy rations and his neglected coursework. You are behind in xenobiology, she said mock stern. Halvey will assign you to teach yourself. Seems fair, Dan said, scratching Kira's chin while Lex tried to eat his notebook. On the 5th, Talon returned with officials Dan didn't recognize and a decision folded like a letter. We will return them to Thornvale, he said. A transport is being prepared. In 3 days. Relief found Dan so fast his knees threatened treason. "Thank you. On one condition." Talon's gaze flicked from Shade to Dan. "You accompany them. She trusts you. We will not risk the bond fracturing in transit. After you return and complete your studies." "Deal," Dan said, before the universe could wake and change its mind. Vor stared at Shade for a long time, measuring himself against a grief he could not punish. "My people died," he said at last, quieter than Dan had ever heard him. "I understand why. That does not remove the weight." "No," Dan said. "It doesn't." Shade watched them both with that unfathomable attention. Dan wondered if any of them would ever know exactly who had saved whom. Transport in 3 days. Across a galaxy, home waits, and so do all the ways this can go wrong. Helix 7 learned how to watch without touching. Students who once refused Dan a seat now lined the viewing corridor in quiet rows, palms pressed to glass, eyes wide as oceans. Shade sprawled in a wedge of lamplight, 8 limbs folded in regality, pretending not to notice the audience. Lex and Kira learned to stalk dust motes and defeat them soundly. Dan sat on the floor cross-legged with a tray he'd forgotten to eat, a pen he'd been pretending to use, and a mind stretched between relief and dread. Nara arrived with a stack of coursework and the look of someone who'd become an accomplice while she wasn't looking. "Professor Halvey says if you miss another lab write-up, he'll promote you to guest lecturer out of spite." Dan grinned despite himself. "I thought I was already guest lecturing through this window." Nara's ears angled in amusement. "You are?" He is jealous. They went through assignments while Shade eyed the pen like a suspicious insect. Every so often, a small line would wriggle into Dan's paragraphs. A growl outside. The thunk of a cart. A message pinging with someone's outrage, someone's gratitude, someone's caution from a system away. The word citizens kept turning up like a stone he couldn't stop worrying with his thumb. Administrators haunted the periphery with their voices set to concerned. They discussed liabilities in low tones, ethics in loftier ones, and funding in the tones people use when they think they're talking about principles but mean payroll. Vor stood at parade rest in the hall more than he stood anywhere else. He kept his hands visible and his grief somewhere no one could accuse him of it. Halvey, to his credit, changed. He came into the room empty-handed, sat down on the floor, and practiced being boring. Shade tolerated boring. Then she brought him the cloth ball and the professor forgot how to breathe for a second. When he tossed it back, she caught it with impossible delicacy, rumbled and returned it. Dan watched a scientist meet his subject's gaze and realized she'd been a subject too, for longer than he'd like to admit. By the second evening, Shade understood the food cart routine. She waited until the guard backed away, then nosed the tray toward Dan as if requiring quality assurance. On the third, she did something new. She ate only after Lex and Kira had chosen. Dan recognized the choreography from home. His mother setting aside the best pancakes for little hands, then pretending her half was the one she wanted all along. Some behaviors are older than language, older than species. He wrote that in the margin of his anatomy notes and underlined it twice. Nara arrived late, breathless, with a data slab. "You need to see this." She tapped the screen. Official seal. Council of Thornvale. The translation had the stiff shape of law. Return of abducted citizens demanded. Sanctions threatened. List of prior incidents attached. Dan scrolled. His stomach tightened. Shade's family was not the first to vanish into a lab with a tidy grant number and a shrug at the paperwork. "It wasn't just us," Nara said quietly, as if reading his face. "But it was us this time." Dan looked over his shoulder. Shade had tilted her head at Nara's tone. Kira was chewing the corner of Dan's notebook like it owed her money. "We fixed this," he said to Nara, to Shade, to the version of himself that wanted to be smaller and safer and was losing the argument. "We fix it in writing, not just in feelings." Nara's ears lifted. "Write the first draft." They worked late, drafting policy bones on the back of lecture notes, acquisition protocols, independent ethics board, ban on purchases from unsourced collectors, mandatory language in all research proposals, presume intelligence unless proven otherwise, and even then presume dignity. Halvey read it through the glass, then opened the door and stepped inside to sign his name on the bottom with a shaking hand. 3 days moved like a slow shuttle, long in approach, sudden in departure. On the morning of the third, Warden Talon came in person. "The transport is ready," he said. Behind him, Vor stood with his jaw working on something he couldn't chew to softness. "Conditions unchanged?" Dan asked. His voice sounded like someone trying on authority and finding it fit across the shoulders after all. Unchanged, Talon said. You accompany them. You return after. We implement policy upon your return. He looked past Dan to Shade. For a moment that wasn't about stations or statutes. The warden bowed his head. We were wrong, Shade blinked. Dan couldn't tell if she understood the words. Maybe she understood the shape of them. The walk to Docking Bay 4 was a procession no one rehearsed. Students lined the corridor and didn't say a thing. Shade flowed behind Dan with the cubs flanking, a geometry of trust that turned every eye soft. Posters someone had scrawled overnight appeared on bulkheads. Learn without cages, bridge, don't break, welcome home, Nightclaw. Dan flushed. The universe felt too big for him and exactly his size. At the airlock, the transport crew waited. Pilot with green scales and too many fingers. Medic with foldable empathy. Cargo tech who kept glancing at Shade like a poet seeing a comet. The hold had been fitted for comfort. Soft flooring, adjustable climate, harness points. That weren't restraints. Shade tested everything with the suspicion of a mother who had learned that comfort sometimes had teeth. Then she looked at Dan and he nodded and she stepped across the threshold. Bring them home, Talon said. It wasn't an order. It was a plea. Dan strapped in as the bay doors cycled and the station's bright geometry fell away. Helix 7 shrank to a bracelet in the dark. Shade paced the habitat once, then chose a corner where she could see everything at once. Kira collapsed on Dan's boots like they were designed for Nightclaw naps. Lex tried to eat a cargo strap until Dan bribed him with a handful of training rations and dignity. The pilot's voice floated back from the cockpit. Course to Thornvale plotted and locked. Dan laid his head against the bulkhead. The hum of engines became a lullaby. In that rhythm he felt, for the first time since the alarms, the outline of hope settle into a shape that might hold. 6 days through the dark. Enough time to learn a language you don't share, and enough time for everything to fail. Space rewrites time. 6 days can be a blink or an epoch, depending on what you're holding. Dan woke to the smell of recirculated air, the hush of a ship that had decided to behave, and a weight across his shins that rumble-purred like distant thunder. Kira had migrated onto his legs during the night. Lex lay with his head on Dan's ankle, guarding a ration crumb as if it were a crown jewel. Shade dozed upright, one eye open, counting breaths. The pilot introduced himself as Kesh, his vowels rolling like stones in water. You are the human with far too much responsibility, he said cheerfully, handing Dan a tray. Breakfast for the diplomats. Diplomats, Dan repeated, and the word fit the room better than passenger ever could. Mornings became practice. Dan tested hand signs he'd sketched on scrap. Palm up, question. Tap twice, again. Point, then splay fingers, many. 2 fingers to chest, me. Flat hand to heart, then extended, safe. Shade watched with a focus that bent the air around her. She imitated some motions with small head tilts and ear angles. Others she dismissed with a blink as if to say we already have a word for that. Yours is clumsy. He swapped his signs for hers when he could catch them. A chin lift that meant listen. A tail tip flick that meant no. A low hum that scaled from content to stay close depending on where it lived in her chest. He learned to listen past the obvious. The difference between Kira's hungry chirp and comfort please chirp resided in the last half-second, and in how her whiskers stood. Lex's warning noise for metal sound bad was distinct from Dan moving away too far, only if you'd slept with his head on your boot enough times to deserve the nuance. Shade had a staccato cough she used only when she wanted silence from the cubs immediately, the way a human parent might deploy a full name. The first time Dan ignored it, Lex sat on his notebook penitently for 10 minutes, which solved nothing and everything at once. Afternoons, Kesh came back with stories of ports and storms. Some crews transport ore, some medicine, he said, but live cargo that isn't cargo? That is rare. I like rare. He looked past Dan to Shade, whose ears angled in a way Dan had learned to read as suspicion melting toward curiosity. You are not the first Nightclaw I have ferried, Kesh said softly. Years ago I took one the other direction, toward a lab. I did not ask questions. Today, I am asking them all, and I am answering the ones I can. Dan thought of the council's message, the word kidnapped, still lodged behind his ribs. He nodded. Thank you for asking now. Shade padded closer and sat with deliberate weight at Dan's side. the way a mountain might sit near a sapling and decide not to cast too much shade. She touched her forehead to his shoulder once, briefly. The contact was ceremonial and ordinary. He checked under his sternum to see if anything had broken open. Only a new room, apparently, with lights on. On the third day, the ship passed a nebula like a bruise blossoming across the dark. Kira stared at it through the viewport with her whole face. Dan tapped the glass lightly. "Pretty," he said. Shade made a soft, sound that he'd come to understand as Agree waited with, I remember. He wondered what night looked like on Thorn Vale. Whether the stars came through trees or over open water. Whether Shade missed the smell of her own dirt. On the 5th, the ship's computer intoned in its reasonable voice. Thorn Vale, visual acquisition. They gathered at the forward viewport. The planet swam into view, mostly forest, veins of riverlight, clouds curled like sleeping creatures. Dan's throat tightened. It was not Earth, but it belonged to someone who had been forced away from it, and that was enough to make it beautiful. Shade rose and sang a sound Dan had not heard from her, something between a howl and a hymn. It vibrated in his bones. Kira and Lex threaded their higher voices around it. Kesh leaned in the doorway, eyes wet and unapologetic. "Good song," he said roughly. "Best I have heard in this room." Landing formalities felt like theater performed with sincere hearts. The ship came down in a clearing ringed by night claws, larger than Shade, some scarred, all alert. Harnesses with translators glowed like fireflies. A gray-silver male with a face like a map of earned victories stepped forward as the ramp descended. Shade did not rush. She tasted the air. She placed one paw on the grass. 2. She froze as if afraid the ground would vanish. Then she bowed her head and sang again. Shorter this time, question folded inside gratitude. The answer rose from the circle like a sudden daybreak. Dan didn't realize he'd put his hand against his heart until Kesh nudged him gently. And he let the hand fall, embarrassed and not at all. The gray-silver stepped close, translator murmuring as it built sentences out of meanings. "We are grateful for the return of our people." "Thank you for letting me bring them," Dan said, stumbling over the formality like a child stepping onto a stage. "They're safe." Shade touched foreheads with the gray-silver, then pressed her skull, gently, impossibly gently, against Dan's chest in a gesture that felt like a blessing and an inventory. Kira and Lex wove around his legs, purring like small engines. Dan laughed because he couldn't stop himself, and because the alternative was crying in front of very dignified predators. The gray-silver extended a slender device. Keyed to her scent and call, for contact if needed. Bonds made under strain often hold the strongest. You are pack even if your limbs are wrong. Dan took the device as if it might dissolve. "I'll be careful with it." "You will be you," the gray-silver said, which might have been the same thing. They stayed long enough for Dan to feel unnecessary in the best way. The cubs tumbled into relatives' care and then tumbled back to Dan for one more scratch and then back again. Shade checked every exchange with the deliberation of a queen counting subjects and children with the same column in the ledger. Kesh touched Dan's shoulder. "We should leave before night. Local storms know how to stand up fast here." Dan knelt. He held Lex's head in Kira's, looking into eyes that would one day be amber storms. "Be loud," he told them, which meant survive and play and never forget that soft is not the opposite of strong. He touched Shade's cheek. She closed her eyes into his palm, and he let himself memorize the weight of that trust because memory would have to do. He walked up the ramp without looking back, because if he looked back, he would not walk. Only when the ship lifted did he press his face to the viewport and find them. A dark shape and 2 smaller ones threading into trees, turning once, lifting their faces to the sky as if scent could follow a ship. "Home delivered," Kesh said softly. "Now we deliver you home to trouble. The return to Helix 7 will be louder than the departure, and fame has teeth." He expected silence at Docking Bay 4. He got a crowd, not the shouting kind, but the kind that knows how to make applause into a weather system. Dan stepped off the ramp into a gust of hands clapping and eyes shining, and people who 2 weeks ago had crossed the hall to avoid his shadow. Nera shouldered through, grabbed his sleeve, and yelled over the thunder, "You are famous." "Bridge builder," Dan made a face. "That nickname's going to stick, isn't it?" "It is already stuck to your door," she said. Someone painted it badly. Warden Talon approached with administrators in tow, colors on his skin tilted toward approval rather than stress. "Welcome home, Dan Rios. The Galactic Council has, how do humans put it, taken notice." "Of me?" Dan said, horrified. Of your method, Talon corrected. Of the outcome. They would like Professor Halvey to circulate documentation. They would like to speak to you about what you call presuming dignity. Dan looked down at his boots. I just treated them like people, which is apparently revolutionary. Talon's mouth twitched in something like a smile. Classes resume tomorrow. So does policy work. Life didn't normalize. Too much had shifted for that. But it found a second orbit. Students who'd avoided him now mapped routes that passed near his chair on purpose. They asked about shade. They asked about Thornvale's trees. They asked how he knew she wouldn't kill him, and he said the only honest thing, I didn't. I made a choice about who I wanted to be in that moment. Halvey invited him to guest lecture in xenobiology. Dan stood at the front of the amphitheater where he'd once been a problem to manage, and showed clips from his tablet. Shade returning a ball. Kira tolerating a bandage. Lex sitting very seriously on a notebook because he had done a disobedience and was performing remorse as a social contract. Laughter softened the room in the right places. Quiet found it in the others. The core lesson, Dan said, is that intelligence is not measured by vocabulary in your language. It's measured by choices under pressure, by the ability to form trust across fear. Shade didn't suddenly become safe. She chose to hold back because I held still. That's not animal training. That's diplomacy. A student with ocean blue skin and 3 hands raised one of them. What if you'd been wrong? Then I would have died, Dan said, and let the answer sit like a stone in a bowl. Sometimes courage is choosing to do the right thing even if it might get you hurt. Sometimes wisdom is knowing when you're not actually the right person to take that risk. I was there. I could help. So I did. After class, a small, soft-furred student approached with a project proposal about interspecies gestures. Dan agreed to mentor if only to ensure the ethics section used his policy draft like scripture. Nera pretended not to be proud of him and failed impressively. Policy meetings were less cinematic. Rooms with stale coffee and bright screens. Arguments about definitions that determined budgets that determined futures. Dan and Nera sat side by side and became the annoying students who kept raising their hands to ask, but what if we just didn't do harm? Halvey wielded his new humility like a tool, redirecting colleagues when old habits tried to return. Vor sat in the corner like a storm convinced to be a mountain for an afternoon. He spoke rarely, but when he did, the room listened, because grief has the authority of a scar. 2 weeks after the transport, a message arrived keyed to the device the gray silver had pressed into Dan's hand. The sound filled the lab like wet leaves in wind, then a short specific call. The translator offered peaceful status in text and then shut up like it had learned taste. Shade was well. The cubs were growing. Dan answered with a clumsy suite of hand signs framed for a camera, and a human smile he didn't realize was as feral as any nightclaw grin. Messages followed at intervals that felt like a pulse. Once only the sound of rain and the soft percussion of paws over roots. Once a low, untranslatable hum that the translator labeled containment, and then added a hesitant question mark as if embarrassed by its own presumption. Dan recorded a reply from the observation deck with stars wheeling behind him and said, Still here. Still translating my way toward you. Months passed. Routine layered over routine. Dan found himself less alone in hallways and more exhausted in new ways. Papers to draft, policies to hammer, students to meet where their fear sat, and invite it to become curiosity. He learned how to end meetings before they cannibalized their own purpose. He learned how to sleep again. One night on level 12, Nera leaned her arms on the rail, fur tipped in starlight. Do you think this actually changed anything? She asked. Or are we just a good story people tell to excuse not changing? Dan thought of Shade's head pressed against his chest, of Vor's heavy silence, of Halvey's shaking signature. He thought of the word citizens in a law text. It changed me, he said. And it changed this place. If we keep at it, that's enough leverage to move a bigger thing. Nera's smile was small and fierce. That is the most human answer. Is that a compliment? Today, she said, yes. Time moves, so do institutions. And change is never done asking you what you're willing to do next. By the end of his first year, Dan had a drawer full of ordinary triumphs, a research paper co-authored with Halvey about reciprocal signaling in high-risk species, a policy packet signed by Talon and 3 external auditors, a first-year cohort that had started imitating his hand sign for safe whenever group work went sideways. 2 plants on his windowsill that refused to die. He also had a reputation that preceded him into rooms where he would rather have been ignored, which is its own kind of gravity. Shade's messages kept arriving irregularly, like rain. The translator learned to be humble. It refused to render most of her sounds into words and instead offered descriptions. Deep contentment, alert curiosity, call from cubs returned. Once, Dan received only a length of silence with the faint crackle of leaves and then a sudden chorus of voices, the pack in some communal ritual. He sat on his bed and listened through eyes closed, not pretending to understand. Not pretending understanding was required for reverence. The second year, Dan's room stopped being a place to hide and became a place to gather. On any given evening, there might be 4 species on the floor eating food that none of them could agree was palatable, and arguing about whether humor required shared idiom or only shared trust. Nira brought spice packets and opinions. A tentacled student developed a taste for human tea and became evangelical about it. 4, of all people, stopped by once with a training manual under his arm and asked Dan to consult on crisis de-escalation language. They spent an hour translating lower your weapon into cadences that frightened less and commanded more. 4 left with a nod that felt like a medal pinned to a place Dan hadn't realized was bare. The Academy's outreach requests multiplied. Dan said yes when they were about building bridges and no when they were about turning him into a mascot. He taught a seminar with Halvey titled Assume Dignity that filled beyond capacity and had to be repeated in shifts. He annoyed an administrator by changing the course description from non-human communication to cross-species diplomacy. He annoyed the same administrator again by refusing to write a foreword for a fundraiser that used a photo of Kira asleep on his boots. No to sentimental leverage, he said, and Nira high-fived him in 2 languages. Shade sent a message near the end of the second year that contained a sound he hadn't heard from her before. Sharp, bright, almost laughing. The translator shrugged. Dan recorded a reply from the observation deck and made a human version. Short bark, grin. He felt ridiculous. He sent it anyway. The next message was a long, satisfied rumble like a purr sewn to a thunderhead. He understood that one just fine. The third year, he was no longer the only human on Helix 7. 5 arrived in a cohort that stared at him with a mix of relief and alarm, as if he might bite. He took them for tea. He told them where the good corners were. He told them the cafeteria's printer had a secret setting. It only revealed to people who said thank you in 3 languages. He told them they were not symbols but people and they could refuse the parts of the story that tried to turn them into anything else. The Academy asked him to speak at the gathering, an annual convocation where people said things wrapped in big words so they would echo. He didn't know what to say until he stood at the lectern and looked out at a room full of faces, all so different you could go blind trying to count the ways, and realized he only needed small words. 3 years ago, he began, I arrived here and found out that fear is efficient. It gets you away from danger fast. But it isn't wise. It doesn't ask questions. It doesn't notice who else is afraid and why. Curiosity is slower. It made me late to class. It also got 3 people home. He told a short version of everything without making himself the hero. Alarms, cubs, a mother, a room with windows, a policy with teeth. He ended with, you don't have to speak someone's language to treat them like they have one. Start there. The applause hammered the walls. Dan stepped back from the microphone with his heart shivering like a bird that had found a window and not broken itself. That night, the device from Thornvale chimed on his desk. The translator said only new voices and then did what wise machines do, fell silent. A higher pitch braided through Shade's call. Kira and Lex had found their own cubs. Nightclaw voices had multiplied in a forest that had once held a silence not meant for it. Dan laughed, full and stupid with joy, and sent a reply that was mostly hands and face and a word he couldn't translate at all, uncle. He slept with the window cracked because the station hum sounded closer to wind when you let it in. If the story began with running toward danger, where does it go when danger is mostly policy and patience? Change is a verb with blisters. The policy committee met every 3rd day for a season, and every meeting felt like lifting a stone that had decided it was part of the planet now. Dan and Nara sat through presentations that died of euphemism and insisted on verbs. Ban not discourage. Require not recommend. Halvey learned to interrupt colleagues gently right before they said the thing that would age poorly. Vor, invited as security perspective, stared down a proposal to install shock barriers for safety until it withdrew on its own legs. They wrote a charter for the ethics board that guaranteed student seats and third-party audits. They added whistleblower protections with real consequences attached to retaliation. They attached funding lines that could not be quietly cut. They defined sentience only to throw the definition away at the end and replace it with assume it, until you are invited to do otherwise by the beings in question. The lawyers grimaced. The board nodded. Somewhere in the building, an accountant made a noise like a kettle coming to a boil. Dan bought that accountant a coffee and a sincere apology later. A collector network pushed back in the way such networks do, with subtle insinuations that research would slow, that breakthroughs would slip to rival institutions, that the academy would lose prestige. Talon called their bluff with a public statement so crisp it could slice rope. Prestige that depends on theft is not worth having, he said. And Dan thought, that sentence is going in a textbook one day. In the middle of all that, classes persisted. Dan discovered he loved the moments when a student's face did the little gravitational collapse that meant an idea had just gone supernova behind the eyes. He also discovered he hated grading. You are allowed to be wrong, he wrote in a margin. You are not allowed to be lazy. He realized with a jolt that someone had once written that in the margins of him. Shade's messages came less often and hit harder. One contained only the low, dense sound that meant storm followed by a silence full of waiting, then the skitter rush of cubs in rain. Another held a terse triad of calls that the translator bravely labeled injury, healed, hunt successful. Dan sent back a human equivalent, a worried face, a relieved face, a thumbs up that made Nara groan. Teach me better Nightclaw for that, he begged, and she did, crafting a short hum that meant I am proud of your survival without sounding like a parent or a poet. The council invited Dan to a round table with representatives from worlds where similar acquisitions had occurred. He wore the same shirt he'd worn to deliver Shade home because he was superstitious now. He spoke less than others and listened more. He watched people realize they were not alone in their injuries. He wrote afterward to Talon, build a network, share protocols, make it expensive to be cruel. Talon responded with a single word, yes. The second-year humans took to calling Dan captain in a tone that managed to be affectionate and deeply annoying. He instituted a rule. Anyone who called him captain had to carry boxes for whatever project he was currently running. The nickname diminished in popularity. The boxes moved faster. Late one evening, as Level 12 showed a freighter drift past like a thought someone had forgotten, Nara asked, "What scares you now?" Dan considered. Institutional creep, he said. The way good rules get dull and slide over time. The way we forget why we wrote them. Then don't let us forget, she said. Be annoying. You're very persuasive. I am very correct. He sent the ethics charter to his first-year self with a note. You did not fix everything. You made it harder to break. Keep going. He imagined that kid standing in a hallway while people avoided him like he carried a storm in his pocket and wanted to time travel just long enough to hand him a better umbrella. A month later, the device chimed with a rapid, high pattern that set his heart racing before the translator even lit. It rendered, pack moved, safe place, new den, and, in a gesture of grace Dan would think about for years, we remember. He answered with a two-handed sign he'd stolen from Human Dance and Nightclaw Ear Tilt both. I'm still here. The Academy calls for a speech that isn't policy or data, something to aim hearts. Dan says yes, and the pass shows up in the front row. Helix 7's gathering didn't so much begin as swell. Dan stood behind the curtain while a student band tried to figure out whether their rhythm section was a percussionist or a mathematician. He had a folded sheet in his hand with words he'd rewritten 4 times and a 5th version in his chest he trusted more. Nara squeezed his elbow. Speak like you're talking to Shade, she said. You're better when you forget to be clever. He stepped into light. The hall breathed in. He could see faces, then couldn't because at a certain distance faces become a single listening organism. He found the front row. Halvey sitting forward like Discovery might fall off the stage if he didn't hold it steady. Talon upright, hands folded like a bridge made from fingers. 4 in uniform, grief worn like a ribbon instead of a blade, the human cohort leaning on one another's shoulders. A dozen species Dan could now greet without embarrassing himself in their languages. He kept his notes in his pocket. "I came here thinking I was dangerous," he said. "I still think that sometimes, but not for the reasons they told me. We are all dangerous because we can choose. We can choose the efficient fear that cages or the slower curiosity that listens. We can choose policies with teeth and kindness that doesn't excuse harm. We can choose to be bridges, and we can choose to maintain those bridges after the first crossing." He told the story fast and clean. Alarms, cubs, a mother, a room with a window, and a policy with verbs. Then he told the part that wasn't heroism but practice, meetings, drafts, edits, enforcement. "Do the boring things," he said. "That's how you hold a world together." He closed with something small. "If anyone here feels like a hazard symbol with shoes, come find me after. We'll get tea. We'll be dangerous together the right way." Applause rose like weather again. Dan let it happen around him and tried not to believe the applause was about him. He stepped down into a knot of arms and congratulations and questions. The humans dragged him toward tea. Halvey said good work in a tone that made the words weigh more than they should. Four squeezed Dan's shoulder like he was testing bone density. Talon whispered, "You saved us work and you gave us work," which is the best compliment an administrator can give. Later, in the quieter corridor behind the amphitheater, the device chimed. Dan stopped walking. Nera stopped because he stopped. He lifted the small translator that had become a second pulse. The sound that filled the hall was shades, not loud but present like a line drawn across distance. Behind it, higher voices, the next generation, wove bright threads. The translator tried and wisely settled on, "We hear you." Dan found a patch of wall and leaned against it. He shaped a reply with hands and face and breath. "Still here," he said into the device. "Still learning how to listen." "Still building," he sent the message. The return came back so quickly it might have been an overlap rather than a reply. A short, certain sound. The translator didn't risk words. It didn't need to. Dan felt it settle in his chest and knew what it meant because language is large and also very small when you need it. Pack. He walked level 12 with Nera until the station's night cycle dimmed. They talked about insignificant things on purpose. On the way back to his room, he passed a wall where a student had stenciled in neat letters, "Assume dignity." Someone else had drawn a little nightclaw ear above the second word, a tip tilt that meant yes. In his room, the drawer with ordinary triumphs made its wooden sound. He put the folded speech notes inside. He added a new sheet on top, a schedule for ethics board audits, dates spaced out like stepping stones, each one a promise that boredom would be weaponized toward good. He added a sticky note that read, "Call Mom, because bridges start at home too." He lay down and let the station hum settle over him. A long time ago, he'd stared at this ceiling and counted breaths until sleep found him. Tonight, sleep found him fast because he had walked a day built from verbs. In the middle of the night cycle, a quiet message blipped his device. Just a pulse, nothing else. He smiled in the dark. Shade didn't always need words now. Neither did he. Morning would come with more meetings, more students, more quiet work that built the scaffolding you don't notice until it fails. It would come with someone calling him captain and carrying boxes because justice has logistics. It would come with tea that tasted like a joke and a comfort, and a planet he'd never seen again except in the color under his eyelids when he thought of trees. He drifted, weightless on a station that spun and somehow stayed still enough to call it home. Somewhere in another gravity, a nightclaw lifted her head at the same imagined moment and knew the strange two-legged being in the sky was awake and not alone. The bridge holds, for now. Beyond Helix 7, other stations still need windows. Other forests still need their families back. The universe does not end with one bridge built. It folds, ripples, spins forward, demanding more crossings. Years, not days, began to measure Daniel Rios's life on Helix 7. The Academy changed colors like a living creature. Policies replaced cages. Laughter replaced whispers. And the corridors that once flinched at the word human now echoed with languages braided together. Professor Halvey retired his lab coat for a teaching robe lined in gray and silver, the colors of the Nightclaws. He credited Daniel at the ceremony and called him proof that empathy is an experiment that never fails. Nera joined the ethics board, her sharp questions carving through bureaucracy like sunlight through fog. Warden Talon left for a seat on the Galactic Council, where his first act was to propose interspecies ethics as mandatory in every academy. When asked who inspired it, he said, "A student who treated compassion as protocol." Daniel stayed. He became a teacher without ceremony, then an advisor, then, almost accidentally, a legend people quoted without remembering why. He disliked that last part. Legend stopped listening. He wanted to keep listening. Each year brought new faces from new worlds. Tentative, brilliant, frightened. He always spotted the one who sat alone at lunch. He would bring them food and say, "This place used to scare me too. Let's start small." He learned 1,000 ways to say welcome that didn't need translation. Messages from Thornwald arrived fewer, but never stopped. The device sat on his desk like a heartbeat made visible. The translator had evolved since its first awkward attempts. Now it simply offered tone suggest warmth, familial or contentment shared. The cubs, grown now, sent sounds that were half greetings, half jokes Daniel couldn't quite catch. He sent back his own noises, low and short, until even the translator learned to stay quiet and let the silence mean understanding. On the 10th anniversary of the Ravenclaw Accord, the treaty that grew from Shade's story, the Academy invited Daniel to speak again. He almost refused, but Nara cornered him in the corridor. "It began with your voice," she said. "Let it echo." He stood once more under the same dome of lights where he had given his first terrified speech. The audience was larger now, students, diplomats, even off-world delegates from Thornwald. A sleek gray-silver Nightclaw elder stood near the front, translator blinking gently. Daniel cleared his throat. 10 years ago, he said, a mother broke through steel to find her children. That day, the question wasn't whether she was dangerous. The question was whether we would keep being dangerous to her. We answered right once. We have to keep answering right. He looked at the young faces and saw himself, alone, curious, trembling. Empathy isn't soft, he continued. It's structure. It's the only architecture strong enough to hold a civilization together, build with it. The hall went silent for a beat that felt sacred, then rose into applause like surf against stone. The Nightclaw elder lifted her head and gave a low, resonant call that the translator didn't dare interrupt. Daniel knew it anyway. Gratitude, recognition, family. After the ceremony, he walked the observation deck one last time that night. The stars hung where they always had, patient and bright. He pulled the small device from his pocket, the same one that had crossed years and distances, and sent a single tone. Not words, just the rhythm Shade had once taught him. Still here. Minutes later, the reply came. 3 short sounds, Lex, Kira, and one higher, newer voice, followed by a 4th, deep and steady. Shade. We hear you. Daniel smiled. Somewhere on a green world wrapped in forests and song, a family looked up at the same stars and thought of him. The bond held. The bridge endured. He turned from the window as the station lights dimmed for rest. Endings, he murmured, are just quiet places where new stories wait. The hum of Helix 7 answered, steady and alive. He walked toward his quarters, the echo of paws and heartbeats traveling with him through the long orbit of stars. Every bridge leads to another horizon, and someone brave enough to cross it.